if you're going to say God's timeless, do you think you're going to say God cannot change? He cannot have a new moment. He can't do one thing and then another. Whereas if you're going to say God's temporal, he can change. He can do one thing and then another.
Sans creation, God was timeless. Would that be a fair way to say it?
I would deny that. Time is an attribute of God. It's one of his essential attributes. So you can't have God being timeless. So you get something that looks almost identical to Craig's view, but you're not saying it's timeless.
Yeah.
You don't have to talk in this kind of weird way of like timeless sans creation. You can just be like, yeah, God existed by himself all alone. And then the next moment is God creating a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's very rare I change my mind on air, but that sounds right to me. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologists. Stelman Smith Jr. here, and every once in a while we have a guest come to the show that really classes up the joint. I'm super excited to have my next guest, Dr. Ryan Mullins. How are you doing, sir?
Doing all right today.
Good. And I have two overlays here. I wanted to show people just some of your work. End of the Timeless God. We'll be focusing on this topic today, God and his relationship to time. And here's another book. You have God and Emotion. But just so people know, where's the best place for people to find you and some of the other work you're doing?
Mm-hmm. So if you go to my website, rtmullins.com, then you can find a lot of the publications that I've done. Not all of them, but a lot of them. You can also find my podcast, the Reluctant Theologian podcast. And then you can kind of keep up with some of my work. I'm at the Collegium for Advanced Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And so they've got some of their stuff on their website as well to help people follow the research fellows.
Awesome. Yeah, so today we're going to be focusing on the topic of God and time. And what we wanted to do, besides just, giving people an introduction to this topic, maybe there's people out there who are already familiar with it. We'll get into some of those more advanced ideas. But for people who aren't familiar with it, it's for you guys too. We're going to really break down some of these terms and get into what they mean. And one thing I really want to focus on as we go on is why it's relevant. Some people might be thinking, well, who really cares? At the end of the day, God's in control of the time, whether it's A theory, B theory, any of this philosophical stuff, who really cares? And for me, it's something I care about. I do think it affects the way I view God and his relationship to us. And I know that's some of the stuff you've talked about. So I guess, just to start off, let's get into, some people even haven't heard of the terms A theory and B theory of time. So maybe we can just start off with like, what is time? And then what are these competing views that philosophers have on it?
Mm-hmm. So what is time is a weird question because most people don't even want to ask that question. And in fact, most philosophers of time don't even ask that question. They'll just quote St. Augustine saying, I know what time is, unless you ask me. And you're like, okay, great. So as I see it, time is this thing, this natured entity that makes change possible. It's the source of moments, and it's the thing that like unifies a series of moments into what we'll call like a timeline. So time is whatever just makes change possible and then just makes these moments exist. And so for me and people like Isaac Newton, we're going to say, well, time is just an aspect of God then, because God's the thing that makes change possible. And God's the thing that is the source of moments and is the thing that unifies a series of moments into a timeline, depending on whichever way God decides to providentially arrange things. Not everybody's happy with that, but that's kind of my take on what time is. But there's the more kind of relevant sort of stuff you typically see in these conversations are things like related to what are called the A theory and B theory of time, and then questions about like the ontology of time or which moments of time exist. So I'll say a little bit about the A theory, B theory, and then I'll talk about the ontology question because that's, I think, a bit more easier to grasp. So the A theory, B theory, here's kind of what they're up to. So philosophers will talk sometimes about writing the book of the world. And so when you're writing the book of the world, what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out what are the basic categories I need in order to give a full description of reality. So say I want to just give like a full description of the world. What are the fundamental concepts or categories that I need? And so the A theory will say, well, one of the most important categories is the present moment of time. Something about the present is objective, it's special, it's privileged in some kind of way. And so if I'm going to write the full story of the world, I need to appeal to certain things called tensed facts. Tensed facts are things about like what is true right now, what is true in the past, like what was the case in the past, and what will be the case in the future. And the atheist is going to say, if you do not appeal to those like tense facts about what is true right now and what was the case in the past and what will be the case in the future, then you cannot give a full description of the world. You've lost something. You've really not given the full like story of the world. The B theorist is going to say that they disagree. So the B theorist is going to say, well, I don't really need references to past, present, and future because there is no such thing as like an objective, special, present moment of time. There's nothing like special or privileged about the present moment. Instead, you might say like all moments just kind of exist, and they are in these what are called B relations. So they are in like earlier than and later than and simultaneous with relations. And so the B theorist will say, I only need tenseless facts. So tenseless facts are facts that do not make a reference to the past, present, or future. So for instance, like Ryan sits on top of Arthur's Seat. Arthur's Seat's like this mountain in Scotland. And so it'd be like Ryan sits on Arthur's Seat at 2 p.m. on the 26th of April, 2021. And that would be a tenseless fact because it doesn't make a reference to the past, present, or future. And then you could also talk in a tenseless way of saying, well, Ryan sitting on top of Arthur's Seat is later than the American Civil War. And the American Civil War is earlier than Ryan sitting on top of Arthur's Seat. So these would be kind of like that's how you'd have to talk in order to like write the story of the world if the tenseless theory is true. You cannot appeal to past, present, and future. You cannot appeal to those kind of tensed facts. You have to only give tenseless facts. Final thing to say about this is its relation to the ontology of time. So the ontology of time is about what moments of time exist. And a lot of times people who affirm the B theory, they're going to affirm what's called eternalism, which says that all moments of time equally exist. This is usually contrasted with what's called presentism, which is the most popular version of the A theory, but there are other views you could have on the A theory. So presentism says what moments of time exist? The present. That's it. Only the present exists. Past moments no longer exist. Future moments do not yet exist. Whereas the eternalist wants to go, no. The year 2525, it doesn't exist from like, your vantage point. Like maybe because you're not there, you're not located there, but it definitely exists. It's just as real as this moment does. In the same way that like Finland is just as real as the US. It doesn't matter that you're not located in Finland. Finland is just as real. And so the eternalist wants to say space and time are just like that. Like things that exist at one location, they're just as real as things that exist at another location. Whereas the presentist goes, that's crazy. No. Present, that's it. The only moment that exists, past, that stuff's gone. Future doesn't yet exist. That's some of kind of the basics for philosophy of time.
Okay. And I think one of the questions I sent you, and I don't know if you've given this some thought. I try to give these things some thought. Is there any like movies or anything that you're aware of that can kind of help illustrate it for people?
Mm-hmm. So basically any of your like standard time travel movies, they're going to be usually doing like a B theory or an eternalist like ontology of time. So like Terminator or Back to the Future. I mean, because the idea is like there's actually a past to go back to. And there's a future that's already that does exist that you can actually go and travel to. Yeah. Whereas if you're a presentist, you're like, I can't go back to the future because like A, I've never been there. B, like there's no future to go to. Like those moments just don't exist. Right. And so I guess if you're like a Rick and Morty fan, like there's a more recent episode, I think it's in this most recent season of Rick and Morty, where like Rick goes on this tangent about we don't do time travel stories in the show. Like that's stupid. Time travel is not possible. We'll talk about like multiverse stuff, but none of this like silly time travel things. And so I'm like, that's more consistent with like an A theory or with presentism, because there's not this other past moments or future moments to go to. You could go to like a different like universe where other stuff has happened, but it's not a different like, you're not going to the past, you're not going to the future.
Yeah. Okay. So one way I tend to think of conceptualizing this, I think it was in one of the Marvel shows. Oh gosh, I forgot the name of it. The one Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. One of the people was discussing, one of the characters in the show was discussing time, and they didn't say B theory, but that is essentially what they were putting forth. They said, look at this book. The entire story of this book exists at once, but if you turn to a particular page, to that character, that's the present moment, but it's really relative to what part in the story you go to. And I really quite like that as an illustration for the B theory, whereas an A theory would be something like you imagine the author's in the process of writing. And so there is a present moment where he's writing what that character's doing, and the past parts have already been written and the future parts haven't been written. So I thought that was helpful.
Yeah, those are good. Those are good.
Now, one of the things I did want to ask you, because I'm a philosophy geek. I've been doing this since college. But one thing I hear a lot of people say is, well, science is really the best place to go to assess the truth. And I know a lot of people, just appeal to the science and say science really supports the B theory, so we're going to go with that. But so I wanted to ask you what you think is the best way to assess which of these philosophies of time are true.
I think you have to do a combination of both. And one of the things that's tricky about this is there's a lot of philosophers who claim the science says X, Y, and Z. When you go to ask the scientists, they themselves will go, I don't know. I don't know. So here'd be an example of this. So I'm going to be hosting a workshop at the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics at the University of Edinburgh. And originally I'd proposed to do a conference on just what is time. And they said, this sounds really cool. We would love to have some philosophers and some physicists get together, but we, the physicists, we don't know what time is. We don't even know how to answer that question. So could you maybe think of a different topic for us to talk about? And so I was like, okay. So I had to change the topic. So it was still time related, but we're not trying to answer that question, what is time? And when I've spoken with different physicists about questions related to say A theory or B theory, sometimes they'll go, I don't like either of those. And here would be one reason for why that's the case. The B theory is going to put all the moments into a coherent timeline. And if the special theory of relativity actually does inform our story of the world, it doesn't really put things in a coherent timeline. And so it doesn't seem to really fit with that. Also, a lot of physicists, they're not terribly interested in those kinds of questions. They'll say things like, just shut up and calculate. We're not interested in these philosophical questions. I just want useful predictions. That's all I care about. So I think, I guess here's the big takeaway. When you're looking at claims that scientists themselves say, a lot of times they're not necessarily interested in the philosophical questions. Some are. I've met some really philosophically interested scientists. I'm married to one, but a lot of times they're kind of I don't know. That's your job, Ryan. You figure that stuff out. I'm just telling you, this is some phenomena I'm seeing. What are the implications of that? That's your job. That's your job.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things I mentioned just because, not to disparage science at all, but
Right.
I feel a lot of times people feel like science, that's the concrete way we know things, and philosophy is just kind of pie in the sky conceptualizing about things that we can't actually know for sure. And I do think that we can use reason to get to the truth of a lot of things, just like we can with science. And even with science, I think Luke Barnes is a great example. This is a man who's not only a brilliant scientist, but a brilliant philosopher as well, to be able to go back and interpret the science the way that he does for things. So now here's another question: is how does the theory of time affect the way we can look at reality? Because somebody might just say, well, does it really matter which is true at the end of the day?
Yes, because I had some students when I was teaching at a high school ask this question, and I was like, okay, let's say eternalism is true. You get this weird thing called counterpart theory. So there's no numerically one thing that is you that persists from moment to moment. Instead, on eternalism, there's a bunch of different Ryans. So for each instant of this video, there's a numerically distinct Ryan that exists. And then they're all kind of in some sort of interesting relationship, such you can kind of talk about them being continuous with one another, but they're all different Ryans. And so I'm like, okay, well, some of the stuff on this view, it seems kind of weird. Here'd be something that sounds kind of weird, but nice and romantic. So my wife and I, one of the first few dates we went on, we went to Glasgow, and she was asking me about some of this stuff, and I was telling her about, on eternalism, you're located at this one moment. You will never be located at a different moment. One of your counterparts, she'll exist at a later moment, but you are stuck at this one moment. And she just kind of thought this idea, well, it's so romantic. She just liked the idea of Ryan and Emma just sitting there for all eternity, stuck on that bench, just having a nice little chat. And I was like, sure, that sounds kind of nice and romantic. But then think about all these really horrible moments in your life. There's a Ryan and Emma, whatever horrible moments that have happened, in my past, there's a Ryan that's located there that is suffering. And he's stuck at that suffering. He will never get into a different temporal location to be able to say, thank goodness that's over. And I'm like, ooh, that's a really kind of ugly view of the world. All the past atrocities, people are located there, and they are suffering, and they will never be able to say, thank goodness that's over. Here's some other kind of problems. This is some problems that what's called the personite problem that Mark Johnston raises. So say I make a promise to you, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this video interview with you and everything. Well, I'm making certain promises, and I will never see the fruition of them. because other later Ryans will be engaged in fulfilling that promise. So I'm making a promise on behalf of my counterparts that they're going to like follow through, because I can't follow through with it because I'm stuck at this particular moment of time and no other moment. So later temporal Ryans, they're going to have to follow through on the promise. So I'm making promises on behalf of other people and being like, yeah, they'll take care of it. And you might think, like, is that really fair to them? Like, they didn't get to have any say about whether or not to like make this promise, but they have to be the ones to follow through with it. And then on top of that, like, say like there's some like really good like reward I would get at the end of all this. Well, all the different temporal like counterparts, all the different Ryans that contribute to bringing about the fruition of making this video, they don't get to see the end result. They don't get to celebrate the end result because they're stuck at their own temporal locations. So they never get to like have their desires and all hard work and everything actually satisfied. And that just it kind of makes morality a very weird, bizarre place. And the way the phrase Mark Johnston uses, he says it's a really trashy like kind of universe that seems like it completely undermines all of our moral intuitions, undermines all of our moral behavior. It's a very kind of ugly view. So you might say it's like a garbage universe or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I heard you actually just this morning. I was watching you on Jordan Hampton's show, The Analytic Christian. That was the first time I heard that argument. Mm-hmm. I was like, wow, I never really thought of it that way before. And then I thought, and maybe this would be an argument from intuition for the A theory, because I thought to myself, well, even if you could, let's say, conceptualize reality that way, think of like a movie where the motion of something moving is kind of just illusory, because what you actually have is these different pictures, right? And that could be a way you conceptualize it. But then I feel like we have an intuition that even if, say, physical reality manifested itself that way, that there's a stream of consciousness that I identify with that continues through all of those moments. Like, that's why I have memories. You know, I have memories just of a few minutes ago and of yesterday. And so would you say a reasonable argument from intuition for something like the A theory?
Yes. So that's what a lot of atheists will do. They'll say, I have memories of me doing various things in the past, not a counterpart of me doing things in the past. I did that stuff. I'm the one who existed just a few moments ago. It just seems obvious to me. Give me a reason to think that I did not exist a few moments ago. So like, yeah, I think and most people will admit the A theory, presentism, they'll typically say this is an incredibly intuitive view. Like they just, a lot of times they'll actually take it to be like the starting point or the default position because it's so intuitive.
Yeah. And I do want to take that and transition that into how it affects Christianity or view of God. But just real quick before then, I was wondering what you thought maybe the best argument in favor of both of these views was.
Oh, in favor of each? Yeah. So and with like the Aetherium with presentism, again, like I just think it's the most intuitive view. And a lot of philosophers will just admit, I mean, it's so intuitive that it's actually the majority view throughout the Eastern and Western world. When I survey all the different philosophical systems in East and West, they all seem to be talking like atheists. They all seem to be assuming presentism is true, except for a few medieval Buddhists. There's who want to try to go with eternalism. So, for example, like when I wake up every morning, I don't wake up and be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the past." You know, like I wake up every morning and be like, okay, I exist at the present. I find myself always existing right now. I never like find myself existing henceforth and whenceforth. You know, I'm always existing now, and it's just obvious. For the B theory, though, for eternalism, what a lot of people will try to appeal to is they'll try to appeal to the special theory of relativity. And here's why. On the special theory of relativity, there's a lot of weird things that are happening there, but one of the things is you cannot find the present moment. You cannot find an objective present moment on the special theory, at least as it's standardly interpreted. And so the story will be like, well, if the best like fundamental theory of science, special theory of relativity, can't find the objective present, then maybe there isn't an objective present. Like why? Like if science can't find it, then maybe it doesn't exist. That's how sometimes the argument goes. I can explain later why that I don't think that argument works, but those are the big ideas.
Well, sure. I mean, would you like to do that now? Go with what your response to that would be?
Oh yeah, sure. If you want, yeah. So the first thing is to point out is to go, okay, well, special theory relativity, there are lots of ways to interpret it where you can find the present moment. And so there's like William Lane Craig has like been this big proponent of what's called like a neo-Lorentzian interpretation, where you have to add a little bit of extra structure to the theory, but it gets you the exact same predictions, it gets you the exact same results, and you can have a way to find the present. More recently, there's been this, I think it's a Polish physicist named Horshawa, who has figured out how to do the mathematics in a much more elegant way that gets you the present moment. And it's actually turns out to be like a very popular view. It's not talked about in philosophy very often, but a lot of physicists will be like, oh yeah, Horshawa, that solves all the problems. So you can find the present on the special theory of relativity. But I think there's a deeper response here, which is to go, special theory of relativity is false. We know it's false. It gives false predictions. So here's an example of a false prediction it gives. So it tells us that that like a clock at like the bottom of a building is going to run at the same rate as a clock at the top of a building, because it's assuming that like they're all kind of in the same, what's called like inertial reference frame. But the thing is, like a clock at the bottom of a building actually runs slower. It doesn't go like it's the ones at the top of the building always end up going faster. So my apartment building in Helsinki, it has 12 floors. So a clock at the 12th floor is going to be running faster than a clock at the bottom floor. And in special theory of relativity, it was predicting the exact opposite. It says like they should be in sync, and they're not. And here's what's going on. Special theory of relativity does not account for gravity. Gravity does all sorts of like crazy things to our clocks. Special theory of relativity, it doesn't account for it, which is why you need the general theory of relativity. So the general theory of relativity says, yeah, special theory, it didn't actually give us the fundamental story of physics. So it's just not the fundamental story of physics. Instead, we need to account for gravity and how it affects our clocks. Within the general theory of relativity, though, you can find the present moment. There's lots of ways to find the present moment. And in fact, the ways that, so when someone says the universe is like 13 billion years old, or maybe 14, give or take a billion years, the way we calculate that is based on our ability to find the cosmic present. So you move into the general theory and it comes right back. Of course, we also know general theory is false because it conflicts with quantum mechanics. And so you're like, oh, okay, well, I thought I had a true theory. And you're like, you got a theory that gives you some useful predictions, but it conflicts with things within quantum mechanics. And with quantum mechanics, there are lots of ways to find the present moment again. But quantum mechanics, since it conflicts with other things we know to be true from relativity, like general relativity, we don't know which is the actual like fundamental story of the world in terms of like the fundamental physics. So what does the science tell us about like time? I just want to be like, I don't know what it tells us about time. If you're worried about like finding the present moment, we've got ways to find the present moment. What's the true story of like the fundamental theory of like physics? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the golden prize everybody's trying to find right now. And yeah, so we'll have to wait and see what happens there. So that's how I'd respond to that. Like when people are like, oh, you're being unscientific because you're conflicting with what special relativity says, I'm going to go, okay, well, if I'm being unscientific by affirming general relativity, which says that I'm conflicting with special, am I being unscientific when I affirm quantum mechanics, which also conflicts with special theory? Am I being unscientific when I affirm that clocks at the top of a building go faster? Because that's conflicts with special theory. Ooh, I'm being unscientific all across the board. I don't know what unscientific means anymore. So I don't know. Those are kind of ways I would respond to that objection to presentism.
Okay, and the questions I had written down were kind of, you can tell me if they basically sound like the same question. I think I wrote, what's the strongest argument in favor of each view? And then I said, what's the strongest argument against each view? Would those be different, or would it be like the strongest argument in favor of A theory is simultaneously the strongest argument against B theory, or would those be different?
A lot of times it's the same. So we've already talked about like one argument against like the A theory, which is special theory of relativity. Right. But there's other ones though that a lot of eternalist and B theorists will put against presentism. And then they'll say that, and then they'll be like, I got an answer to this kind of worry. So therefore it's in favor of my view. Here's one, truth maker theory. So if I want to affirm a proposition like Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States, and notice I said like he was, because he's dead, he's gone. But that's true, like fact about the world. He was the president of the United States. And a B theorist will go, well, what makes that true? Because typically the idea is that what makes something true is that there's something in reality that exists for that somehow connects up with like these things that are true, these true statements. So if I want to say Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States, well, what's the thing that exists in reality for that truth to link up to somehow like connect to? And if you're a B theorist, you're going to say, well, that past moment, it exists. Like the moment of like Lincoln being the president, like that's there, like because like all these moments of time never cease to exist. But if you're a presentist like me, well, then you're like, well, that moment's long gone. Like, oh gosh, there's nothing, it seems like, for it to like this truth to connect with. There's nothing in reality for it to connect with. There's no thing that makes it true. It's a truth maker objection. And so that's the objection. Is the objection at least like clear enough?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Here's how I would respond to it, though. One kind of response is to go, well, let's just find stuff that exists in the present that can make that true. And if you are a Christian, you've got a ton of stuff that's like that exists in the present that can make that true. So one thing is God. God exists, and he's got this infallible memory. And you're like, okay. And so he just remembers that that's how things were. And an infallible memory, it seems like a good like solid foundation for like, what's true. Another thing could be, well, God has the accidental property of being the thing that sustained Abraham Lincoln in existence. So there is like this like actual thing that presently exists, like a property of God's, of which, he is the thing that did sustain Abraham Lincoln in existence. But if there's other things within your Christian story that like I'm strongly attracted to, so I want to believe in something called the intermediate state, which is where your soul goes after you die, but while you're waiting for resurrection. And so I want to say Abraham Lincoln, he still exists. Like, yeah, he's dead, but he is currently living somewhere waiting for the resurrection of the dead. And where is he? He's in the intermediate state. So he presently exists. And so he can ground all the truths about him because he is the 16th president of the United States. So there he is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are some ways to try to like find stuff that presently exists. And then there are a bunch of other people who even reject presentism, who will just go, this whole idea of truth maker theory is super weird. I don't necessarily even need it. And so there are people who deny presentism who will just go, why think that like once something ceases to be, that like the truth about it just ceases to be as well? That's just a bizarre world. Right. Like just because like, that past moment's gone, does that mean like the stuff in the past no longer happened? That's an ugly universe. Like surely things just like once they're made true, they just stay true. End of story. I don't need to say any more. And I like that. That's a much easier story than like me trying to find all this stuff that exists. Like just to go, that's silly. No, we're done. Like it's a simpler answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's what I was thinking. You can tell me what you think of this. I was thinking, I remember William Lane Craig saying, and it was in a different context, but the way he said it was, the past is stuff that has been instantiated into reality. So like the future, that's completely potential, but the past is something that was actualized. And then I thought, if I can make that connection, that where you're saying, well, could we look around in the present day and say, are there present things that what happened in the past affected? And we could look at our history books. We could look at movies that we have about Abraham Lincoln. And to me, that seems, if it has effects that affect the present, and we're at least saying the present is real, then we could still say the past is true.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who have tried to push this, and so they'll call it like a tracing response. And so what they're doing is they're trying to say there are presently existing traces of the past. Sometimes the complaint in response will be there's not enough stuff that exists to like justify all like or just like ground all the truths about the past, which is why I was like, well, God's infallible memory seems like that to me. That problem goes away real fast because you're like, well, surely God's infallible memory is pretty exhaustive. Like that's got more than enough content to ground all the truths about the past. So I think you're right. You're onto something, but that's the response. But that's why I was like, God's memory. There you go. That's more than enough stuff.
Yeah. So I do want to go into God's relationship to all this, but one more thing I wanted to run by you was an argument that Tim Stratton shared with me that I quite liked against a B theory of time, and I was really curious as to your thoughts on it. So he made the argument that it kind of undermines like a causal chain. It undermines the idea that things say that cause another thing. If you have event A causing event B, well, you've really undermined that relationship between the two things and said you'd actually don't need event A to happen for event B. And the way he says that is if two moments in time, and this say directly causes this, but if they're both equally eternal and grounded in reality, then they both need something more fundamental than them causing them. But as soon as you can take event B and explain it by something more fundamental, then event A becomes at least not necessary in causing event B. And I don't know if that's clear enough or what if you think of it. I could probably explain it a little bit more.
No, because he had asked me about this a little while ago as well. I think that the B theorist is going to find this unconvincing, and here's why. So the B theorist is still going to say, like, event A is earlier than event B, and
Hmm.
you'd be like, but look, why that's the case? And I'm like, well, because event A is what causes event B, and causes are always prior to their effects. And so the B theorist still says there is succession, there is change in the world. It's changes is like things being different at one time and being a different way at another time. So there's still going to say there's causation. There's still going to affirm all this sort of stuff. Um, so what it seems like though is Tim's wanting to add like another layer into there to be like, okay, well, what explains why A causes B if they're both eternally existing? And I think the B theorist is just going to go, there's no need to explain that. So I think that's where the premise you'd need to justify, like, why is it just the case that because A and B are both co-eternal that I need some further thing to explain the causal like relationship between A and B. So I think that's where they're going to push back.
Sure.
And actually, I know they're going to push back because usually they'll run a similar kind of objection against presentism. They'll be like, well, event A doesn't exist anymore to cause event B if you're a presentist, because that stuff like ceases, like all that past stuff's gone. And they'll be like, well, you can't account for the causal relation. So you need these things to be eternally existing in order to explain the causal relation. And so that's like a lot of ways, like the B theorist will argue against the presentist. So I think the stories, I think it's, yeah. So I think this one's just going to be a little more complicated to kind of sort through. Yeah.
So maybe if I put it this way, so let's say, traditionally speaking, when we talk of any given event, we would understand that there's a causal chain that leads to it. So like, let's say tomorrow I'm with you in Scotland, right? Well, we would assume something like, well, that means today I had to get onto a plane, or maybe we could even, conjure up something more complicated. I was kidnapped and taken there, whatever the story may be. We might tell causal chain. We wouldn't just say that tomorrow I just appear there. Nothing, no prior causes, nothing happened to get me there. I just somehow appear there. And so let's say a B theorist is a Christian, right? And they think that God created a B block universe and he decided to do it in a way. I quite like the analogy as someone who writes screenplays of where characters in the movie God writes. And let's assume he wants to write it in a way where there's causal chains. And so, he can write it in a way where I get on a plane and then end up in Scotland. But it seems to me God is also at liberty to write a universe where there isn't these causal chains, where I do just appear in Scotland tomorrow. In that case, God would be the more fundamental cause of me being in Scotland. It wouldn't be necessary, at least, that I get on a plane the day before. And so maybe I feel like that's what the analogy is driving at. And then even maybe a naturalist, whatever their explanation for the universe is, you could say, well, why is it necessary that there's a causal chain and not just random events?
So I guess in the first analogy you gave, if God's really writing a B theoretic universe, then he's going to write in the causal chain. So he's going to, like, part of the story of that he's writing is you get on the plane takes off at such and such altitude at such and such time. It travels to such and such a distance, and probably right at the moment you're going to have to go to England and then like sneak into Scotland because you can't go directly to Scotland without quarantining in a hotel. So, and that'll all be part of the causal chain. The B theorist will say, yeah, and all those events are part of the causal chain, and all those events just eternally exist. And then if you're a Christian, they're also going to be like, and God is just eternally sustaining these events in existence or something like that. So the whole causal chain's there. Yeah. So that's why I guess I'm missing like what's forcing the B theorist to deny the existence of the causal chain.
So there's a causal chain in the sense that whatever God causes, he can cause. But it seems that God is at liberty to directly cause me being in Scotland without writing in there something.
The rest of the other stuff,
like you getting on a plane. He could just instant. Now reality is different now.
Yeah. So you could. Okay. So two thoughts, I guess, on this. One is, sure, I guess God's at liberty to do that, but you would still have a causal chain because you would have God going, aha, now you're here. So God would be the part of the causal chain. And then if you're an atheist or a presentist, you could do the same thing. Like you could be like, God's like, you could get on a plane, or I could just go, aha, now you're in Scotland at the next moment. So yeah, it seems like this haha, snapping fingers, like God would be part of the causal story. So you'd have a causal chain on the B theory and the A theory, and God would be part of that causal chain on the A theory and the B theory. So I don't see it as a special, unique problem for the B theorist. But again, there might just be some stuff I'm missing. I'm not thinking about at the moment. But
maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here, and I hope anybody watching finds it worthwhile. I guess for me, because we're saying God is ultimately the explanation of me being in Scotland.
Yes.
And so whether that's because he decided for me to get onto a plane or because he decided to snap his fingers, he's the explanation. It's not at least necessary that the explanation is something that lied within the universe itself. Yeah. And so on an A theory, at least God's writing it out in sequential order. Whereas in a B theory, if it's all just there could just be random events. At least you wouldn't have to appeal to past event as necessary.
Yeah, I think it's going to need some more details to get that argument up and running. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I just think it needs some more details. Yeah.
No, fair enough. So now to get into God, because there is a debate about God being timeless, and even the way I understood it, I always accepted creation ex nihilo, these kind of things, an A theory of time, and then I think I just, without thinking too much about it, thought, but of course God is still timeless. It wasn't until I read William Lane Craig that I learned of the idea of God becoming temporal with creation. So maybe for someone who hasn't even heard of that discussion, that God might be temporal now or timeless now, maybe we could unpack that a little bit for the audience.
So let's just define some basic terms for people.
Yeah.
So everyone wants to say God is eternal. And what it means to be eternal is to exist without beginning and without end. So no one's denying that God's eternal. When you say that God is timeless, you have to add some more claims. We have to do the same thing if you're going to say God's temporal. So if you're going to say, let's start with timelessness. So you're going to say God's eternal. So God exists without beginning and without end. What you add to that is you also say God exists without succession, meaning like God doesn't change, like he doesn't do one thing and then another. And then you're also going to say that God exists without temporal location. So he doesn't exist now or back then or henceforth. And then you're going to say that God does not exist with temporal extension, which means you don't have God persisting from moment to moment to moment to moment. So that's timelessness. So without beginning, without end, without succession, without temporal location, without temporal extension. Now, if you're going to say that God's temporal or in time, what you're saying is God's eternal. So God exists without beginning, without end. Then you add more content. And the more content is God can exist, can undergo succession. So God can do one thing and then another. He can have new moments in his life. And God can have temporal location because he can exist right now. If you think God's omnipresent, then you might want to say God exists right now. And if you think God's omniscient, then you might want to say God can hear my prayers right now. And then you would say God can have temporal extension, meaning God persists from moment to moment to moment. So the whole fact that this universe is persisting from moment to moment is because the omnipresent Lord is sustaining it in existence from moment to moment to moment. So those are the two things. So I guess for the main focus for here would be, if you're going to say God's timeless, do you think you're going to say God cannot change? He cannot have a new moment. He can't do one thing and then another. Whereas if you're going to say God's temporal, he can change. He can do one thing and then another.
Okay.
So those are the two positions, at least.
Yeah. So I don't want to complicate things. So maybe I'm just getting my terminology wrong here. But the way I might say it is, we both want to agree, right, that sans creation, God was timeless. Would that be a fair way to say it?
I would deny that. Okay. So there are some, like William Lane Craig's going to say that he's going to agree with you. But there are a lot of other philosophers of time who want to go, Craig, I love you, but I don't know exactly what you're saying at that moment. Like, what is this whole timeless sans creation stuff? And so a lot of people have really pushed back hard on this, including people like, say, like Richard Swinburne or Dean Zimmerman or myself, who want to say God is temporal. Okay. But we're just like, how do you get this timeless state of affairs? And what exactly does that mean that it's not before creation? Because you can't have it before, because then you'd have time. So what's going on here? And since I want to,
yes,
exactly right. So since I want to say that, like I said at the very beginning, I affirmed this weird view that Isaac Newton affirmed, which is that time is an attribute of God. It's one of his essential attributes. So time is the thing that makes change possible. Well, God's the thing that makes change possible. Time is the source of moments. God's the source of moments. Time is the thing that unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline. Well, God is the thing that providentially arranges a series of moments into a coherent timeline. So I want to say time is an attribute or an aspect of God. So you can't have God being timeless in the same way that you can't have God being, unloving. Like, it's just part of his essential nature.
Okay, so
that's a provocative claim.
No, it's okay. This is awesome because it's new to me. So this will
Oh
be
yeah,
really fun to explore. So, okay, so what I would have said was what I've heard Craig say, which is God is timeless sans creation. So just without creation, like you said, to avoid the before language.
Mhm.
And then he becomes temporal with creation. And I was quite happy with that view. So, but now I'm hearing something different. So I guess maybe one of the worries I or others might have is if God is always temporal, is this problem of kind of an infinite
Mhm.
past, which there have
Yep.
been philosophical arguments to against. So how would you kind of respond to that?
Yeah, that's the exact objection to bring up. So if it is the case that there's an infinite series of moments, like an actual infinite series of moments before God creates, you get all sorts of problems. One, like I think it's impossible to traverse an infinite. I don't think you can actually like undergo an actual infinite number of moments. So you would never get God reaching the point where he could create.
Right.
That's pretty bad. Another problem is if you get this question that Leibniz brought up against Samuel Clarke. So Clarke affirmed the same view that Newton does and the same view that I do to some extent. So Newton and Clarke would have said there is an earlier moment that God could have created. God could create the universe earlier. And Leibniz goes, well, why didn't God create the universe earlier? Like, what was he doing? He's got to have some good reason for creating it when he does. And Clark's like, well, all the moments of time, they're equally like good. And Leibniz is like, yeah, they're all equally good. So why create this moment instead of at that moment? Seems like God's performing an arbitrary action, which goes against the idea of God being perfectly rational. And I'm like, oh yeah, these are two really serious problems. Well, it doesn't matter. Richard Swinburne already solved it for us. So Swinburne's like, well, it's just one moment prior to creation, and did that moment begin to exist? No, the first moment didn't begin to exist. How long does the moment last? No. How long does a moment last is a meaningless question. How long does a particular like event or series of events, like that's a meaningful question because like temporal length or temporal duration, that's something that takes place over a series of moments. But if you're talking about a single moment, there's no answer to that question. So could God have created sooner? No, there is no sooner. Was he undergoing an infinite number of changes and moments? Well, no, because it's just one. So you get something that looks almost identical to Craig's view, but you're not saying it's timeless. You don't
Yeah.
have to, and you don't have to talk in this kind of weird way of like timeless sans creation. You can just be like, yeah, God existed by himself all alone, and then the next moment is God creating a bunch of stuff.
Okay, so that seems right to me. So
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, really the only difference is Craig would say creation is the first moment,
Yes.
right? But so you're
Yep.
just saying, well, no, the first moment was what Craig would call the timeless state, but it's just kind
Yep.
of
I'm
the
just saying it's
state of
temporal.
God
Yeah.
existing and eternal love with the Trinity, and then the
Mm-hmm.
second moment is creation.
Yeah. And so people who have been working on like creation ex nihilo and like problems related to like the Kalam cosmological argument. So Andrew Loke has been doing this quite a bit, and he's got a recent paper where he points out and actually cites me saying like, yeah, Mullins' view perfectly fine with the Kalam. It's like perfectly acceptable. And I was like, okay, good. So I've got one like, proponent of Kalam saying, yeah, Ryan, your view is fine. And then Craig's got a newer paper coming out where he's saying people like Alan Padgett or Richard Swinburne, who affirm views very, very similar to my own. He's like, yeah, their view is totally consistent with the Kalam as well. And I'm like, okay, so now I've got two major proponents of the Kalam saying my view is perfectly consistent with the Kalam argument. So none of these infinity problems seem to be plaguing my view, unless somebody
Yeah.
can like sneak it in somewhere else. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's very rare I change my mind on air, but that sounds right to me. So I'm really happy to go with that. So now, okay, so now if we're going down the rabbit hole of arguing God is temporal, not timeless, I think for a lot of Christians, a red flag goes up and goes, wait a minute, I've always been taught, God is changeless, God is eternal, God isn't subject to like changes in the universe. So how would you kind of ease their concern there?
The first concern, like the way to ease it would be like, just read the Bible. Because the Bible does the Bible doesn't know anything about a timeless God. Almost all New Testament and Old Testament scholars will say like, yeah, all the words for eternity just quite literally mean a long time. They're all temporal words, and it just doesn't have any hint of timelessness. And in fact, when you look at Revelation describes God as the one who was, is, and is to come, and it continually does this like three part description of God. This is a God of the past, this is a God who is right now, and a God with the future. Why is that significant? Well, here's why. there's a very well established way of talking about God being timeless by referring to a timeless present, by just saying God is the eternal one who is. And this is well established by the time the book of Revelation is written. Nobody is like talking about God in terms of the one who was, is, and is to come. And so when Revelation does that, it seems the author has a very easy way to describe God in a timeless manner available to whoever this author is, but it doesn't do it continually and persistently. Just like, no, this is the one who was and is to come. This is the one who did all that amazing stuff in the past. This is the one who's with us right now. And this is the one who's going to do all these amazing things in the future. And so this is a very interesting kind of like seems like it's rejecting this timeless description and going, no, I'm affirming a God with a really interesting past, because that's really important to the Hebrew people, that this is the God of our forefathers. This is a God of the past. And he's made promises, and in the future, he better keep those promises. Like, that's really like essential to like a lot of Jewish identity. This is a God who's going to do that. So the first thing would be just read the Bible, because the Bible describes God as not always creating the universe, and then he does. So it's a new moment. Mm-hmm. He's not always entering into a covenantal relationship with Moses, but at some point he's like, hey, God. God's like, hey, Moses, come here. I want to enter into a relationship with you. And Moses is like, oh, okay. Well, I guess we could do that. It doesn't quite go down like that, but yeah. And then he wasn't always incarnate, but then somehow in the fullness of time, he became incarnate. So these all seem like new moments in the life of God. So that's the first way to kind of like warm some people up to the idea.
Okay. And maybe you could unpack this one. Because one thing I think of is when people say change, again, to go back to William Lane Craig, one thing he's kind of talked about is a difference in like changes in the nature of God versus kind of trivial changes. So there could be a trivial change, like God knows what is happening right now, what has happened and what will happen. And then in the next moment, now God has kind of categorically that falls into different things, but God is still omniscient through all moments. He's still all powerful through all moments. So maybe you could talk a little bit to that.
Yeah. So there's what's called essential change and accidental change. And so essential changes, usually a lot of people want to go, you can't have that because you can't change your essence. So your essential properties are things that you have that you couldn't exist without. And when we look at God, well, God's essential properties, his essential nature, are things like being eternal, being all powerful, perfectly loving, and having perfect freedom. And God cannot exist without those things because those are essential to who he is. Whereas accidental changes, like, becoming the creator of a universe, well, that depends on God freely exercising his power. Like, God doesn't have to be the creator of the universe. And so when God becomes the creator of the universe, well, that's an accidental change that God undergoes because he's freely exercising his power. He didn't have to do that, but he freely chose to. Same thing with like changes like becoming the redeemer of the human race. Didn't have to do that, but he freely exercised his power to do that. Being the judge of all men. And he didn't have to create any like human persons to and then judge them, but he decided to freely exercise his power to create human persons. And because he's perfectly moral, he's going to judge them. So these are all accidental like properties that God takes on. And these are accidental properties that you see like affirmed throughout scripture, that God is the creator, Lord, judge of all men. These are changes that God undergoes. They don't change his nature, but they are changes that God does as he freely changes in exercising his essential properties.
Okay, and so what would you say is a reason someone ought to believe that God is temporal rather than timeless? Would there be any problems with God remaining timeless?
So other than like the biblical arguments that we just run, a very serious problem is, well, you pointed out one is related to omniscience. So if God really knows all the things, then he better know what time it is right now. Because if he doesn't know what time it is right now, then it'd be like, you're not doing a very good job at being omniscient. There's a whole bunch of stuff you don't know. If God is supposed to be omniscient and know what time it is right now, the answer to that question is constantly changing, because like the sum total facts of reality that make up the present moment, those are constantly changing. And so if God's knowledge is actually going to track what's happening in the world, it needs to be able to track all of those changes that are going on in the world. And if he's timeless, then he cannot know what time it is now, because that would involve God changing. It would involve his knowledge tracking all of these changes that are going on in the world. And so you're just not going to be able to get an omniscient God. There are a bunch of classical theists in the tradition, though, who just go, yeah, that's fine. So like St. Augustine's just like, yeah, he doesn't know. But it'd be really terrible if he did know that stuff, because then he'd be changing. To which I want to go, well, you didn't do a very good job at giving me an omniscient God then. what's going on here? So
Mhm.
so yeah, I guess it kind of depends if you think what's is more important. Are you more convinced that omniscience is a perfect, like one of the God's perfections, or are you more convinced that God's immutability is, or his timelessness is the perfection?
Right.
I think omniscience is a really obvious one. So if I want to go with omniscience being the perfection, so God's going to have to
Yeah.
know what time it is now.
So could a B theorist respond, if I'm going to play devil's advocate
Mhm.
here, by saying something like, well, just like when we're asked the question, can God create a rock so big it can't lift it? Well, we would say, well, that doesn't fall into the category of all powerful because that's not a thing. That's not a thing to do. Just like we would say, well, does God know how big the rock would have to be for him not to be able to lift it? You would just say that just doesn't fall into a category of something for God to know.
Mhm.
So could the B theorist say deny that present moments exist and say it's just not a thing for God to know? So God is still omniscient in the sense that he just knows all of the tenseless facts.
Yes, that is the exact move they make. So you see this with Paul Helm, you see this with Kate Rogers. A lot of different people do this. So when at the beginning of the video, we talked about the B theory, the tenseless theory. And so they say tensed facts, they're not a part of the fundamental story of the world. There's nothing special about the present. There's no objective present. So just get rid of all that stuff. There are no tense facts to know. There's just the tenseless facts. And so, yeah, what time is it now? That's one of those silly, like, tensed facts that doesn't really carve reality at its joints. It's not fundamental to the world. So God doesn't there's nothing really there to know. So yeah, so like he knows all the tenseless facts because that's the real stuff. So he's got all that. So he knows everything. So he knows everything there is to know. It's in the same way that open theists will say the future doesn't exist, so there's nothing there for God to know. So he knows all the stuff.
Sure.
And then someone who wants to affirm timelessness and the B theory, they're going to say, well, yeah, there's no like tensed facts for God to know, so there's nothing there for God to know. So he's still omniscient. So yeah, that's one way to respond. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, so how would you respond to that if they said that?
Oh yeah. So I just want to go, well, you didn't tell me the full story of the world because I know there are tensed facts. So for instance, I know what's happening right now. Like I'm responding to like certain things in my purview at the moment. I'm being receptive to certain tense facts. All of my actions, all of my emotions, they are about tense facts about what is happening, what is about to happen, or I can say, thank goodness that's over. That's an appropriate response to something that has just happened in the past. These are real facts in the world. They are not reducible to tenseless facts. And if you can't tell a story of the world about me responding to things that are past, present, and future, then you're not telling the fundamental story of the world. Here's a further way to think about this. Did you have something to say before that?
No, that's no, good. Continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So sometimes people say that the tenseless story is the true scientific story of the world. And so my wife's a biologist. And so one night we were like, let's see if we can come up with an experiment where you only rely on tenseless facts. You don't rely on anything about what's happening right now or what will be happening soon or what was the case in the past. So, we're only relying on tenseless facts, no tense facts. Can we design an experiment like this? Well, we could design the experiment. We could say that, like, at this at time tx, this particular reagent needs to go into this cell, and at time ty, this you need to follow up and do this other thing to the cell. But actually doing the experiment, you can't do that without relying on tense facts. Like I need to know what's happening right now in order to figure out well, what time is it right now? Oh gosh, I need to run upstairs really quick and do some stuff to my cells. Like if I don't have access to those tensed facts, I cannot actually do the scientific experiment.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay. So if we get rid of all the tense facts, then we can't do science. That's bad. Seems like if you really want to be scientific, you need to be able to do science. And so if you want to be able to do science, you need tense facts. So yeah, you got to have tense facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really great example because just how, even if, let's say someone wants to deny something like libertarian freedom, they still can't really behave in the world as though that's the case. As soon as they deliberate, on an actual serious choice, they've lived out something different. And it's the same as you're saying, even if you're trying to conduct that experiment, the second you say, oh, wait a minute, did you do the thing that we needed from before I do this right now? As soon as you say that, you're assuming, facts. I really like that. Okay, so one thing I want to ask, and you've touched on it already when you talked about the biblical evidence, but I just wanted to give an opportunity to expound on it more because I feel for a lot of Christians, this is a really important thing. Like, what does the Bible say and why is it relevant to God? Is how does our view of time affect the way God relates to us?
Mhm. Well, so one of the things is you actually get God relating to us. So the classical tradition from like Augustine and not Anselm doesn't say this, but Augustine, Aquinas, and like a bunch of others, they say that God is not really related to the universe, precisely to protect God being timeless and God being unchanging. Because if God's really related to the universe, then he's going to be undergoing changes, like becoming the creator. And they'll be like, well, God's not really, he doesn't actually have the property of being the creator. And I'm like, okay. And he doesn't actually have the property of being Lord. And they're like, no, of course not. Does he have the property of being like our savior or redeemer? No. He can't actually have those properties. Those are accidental properties. He doesn't have those. And I'm like, okay. Yes. Tell me more about this Christian story where there's a God without being, and then someone who is a classical theist herself, Kate Rogers, she's a classical theist. She wants to affirm timelessness, immutability, all this stuff. And she just looks at this no real relations doctrine. And she's like, you've just denied explicit Christian claims. Like this, you can't, no, you just can't say these things and still like consider yourself to be Christian. Like you right. have to have a God actually like actively engaged in the world. Because God's the thing that's omnipresent, like sustaining the universe in existence from moment to moment. So I think if you make God, but she still don't think she can get timelessness. I don't think she can, but I think her reaction is the right reaction. If you want a God who is actually like really related to the world, which seems like that's what Christianity just assumes, if you want a God who's omnipresent, I think you're going to have a temporal God. So one of the big things you get from temporality in terms of thinking, how does God actually relate to us, is you actually get a God who relates to you. Whereas if God's timeless, you do not get a God who's really related to you. And so it's pretty big to be able to just say like, first up, oh, I got a God who's related to me. Cool. From there, I can build in other things about how I think God responds to you. So your prayers, God actually listens to them and actually responds to your prayers. Because you can't really get that on timelessness, because God cannot respond to anything that happens in time, because that would assume that like one thing happens and then he responds. You can't get that on timelessness, because God doesn't have, if he's timeless, he doesn't have a and then he does anything. So I think if you just want to tell the coherent story of the Christian faith, that's what you get from divine temporality, is you can actually start coherently telling the Christian story.
Yeah. Well, and so could the B theorist say something like, well, there just is the fact of an earlier than moment where God's listening to a prayer, and then there just is the fact of a later than moment where he's responding to the prayer, and so you can still have the story and it's fine.
Mm-hmm. That's how a lot of people like Paul Helm and Kate Rogers want to respond. I want to say this demonstrates that you're not really being consistent with timelessness. So actually Paul Helms pointed this out a lot more strongly in some recent papers. God, if he's timeless, cannot have any before, after, or simultaneous with relations to creation. Because if you have those kind of relations, you're not really timeless. If you're timeless, you can't be before or after or simultaneous with. Those are all temporal relations. Mm-hmm. And so Paul Helm in some more recent papers, he's like, you wanted a timeless God. This is the consequence. You can't have temporal relations if you're a timeless being. And so I think when you've got the B theory of time and you want to say, God's co-eternal with all these moments of time on the B theory. And he's present with, he's wholly located at all these moments, sustaining in existence. I want to go, you just introduced some simultaneous with relations. He's simultaneous with all these different moments. He's wholly located all these moments. So you can introduce some temporal location as well. What about the whole, like, God exists without temporal location part? Like, you lost that. Ooh, so you don't have timelessness anymore. No temporal relations, but like, well, he's simultaneous with that moment. Ooh, okay, so you lost the timeless bit there again. So I just want to keep just pointing this out, going like all along the way, you've lost the timelessness aspect.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to do another devil's advocate objection to that, but first I want to introduce something that I've thought of, and I'd like to know what you think about this. So one thing I thought about was with relation to the incarnation, right? This isn't just an immaterial God kind of up here interacting with the world, but God actually entering into time and entering into the world. And it seemed to me bizarre, and not that something being bizarre means it's not true, but
sure.
Nevertheless, it seemed bizarre to me to think on a B theory that God would simultaneously be eternally suffering as Christ on the cross, and also in the future moment in the new heavens and the new earth enjoying fellowship with us. That's all just simultaneously eternal. That just seemed wrong to me. It seemed that from God's perspective, he was going to enter into time as Christ, And then there was a present moment when he did that. And now he's looking forward to the new heavens and the new earth, when he enjoys fellowship with us because of what he had done, and he's not suffering anymore. And so to me, that just seems right. That seems true. And I'm curious, this is what you think of that.
So I talk a bit about this in the last chapter of The End of the Timeless God. And I've also got some papers, one of which is coming out very soon, looking at this issue a bit more detail. So original argument I wanted to run was similar to yours, to just go, well, that's just really weird. Like, come on, like that just can't be right. This other view is much more intuitive. Just say like God just wasn't always incarnate, and then he became incarnate, and he's got this whole future of like, that he's going to establish at some point. That's just more intuitive. And then I was like, well, my friend Tim Paul, like he's been doing all this amazing work on the incarnation. He's going to have a whole nice story to tell about how he can get all this stuff together. And I'm like, okay. So I need a little bit more. And so here was the more, was digging deeper into the details of going, how do you really get, if God's timeless, how do you really get God being somehow like timelessly suffering on the cross, but then timelessly like enjoying this heavenly feast with us and being super excited and giving us a beatific vision? How are you going to get that eternal suffering and eternal happiness? Because that seems like a contradiction. And they're like, well, it's only certain parts. So the timeless part of Jesus Christ, of God the Son, he's like in a state of eternal bliss. You can't possibly be like moved from that state of eternal bliss. It's only the human nature of Jesus, that part of Jesus. That's the only part that's suffering. And I'm like, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper. And so what you end up getting is this. You end up getting, there's one divine mind and divine will that is in a state of pure, undisturbed happiness, timelessly in a state of pure, undisturbed happiness. And then you get another human will, or human mind and human will, that is in this state of misery. It's in a state of like hunger, and a state of suffering. And I'm like, okay, so I've got two minds, two wills. And you want to tell me they're the same person, even though they have radically different like conscious states? That sounds like Nestorianism. And in fact, Nestorius himself said, yeah, that's the view I affirm. But it's not Nestorianism. I swear, is kind of the response to this. But yeah, I just want to push hard down, or like really hard, and be like, no, this just is Nestorianism. If you really look at the fine grained details of how they're trying to tell the story, I just can't see how it is not Nestorianism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, no, I agree. Now, so to go back to what I think a beer theorist could respond, because you're talking about simultaneous with moments. Right. And it seems they might want to say something like, okay, God can have, and maybe they wouldn't say this is just me, but maybe they would say, okay, God can quote unquote have these relationships to moments, but because they're not unfolding one after the other, they're just all simultaneously existing, and God just eternally simultaneously exists in relationship to those. We can call them moments, but they're not successive moments, so we can still maintain the B theory and reject the A theory.
That was something I noticed when I was working on the first book, The End of the Timeless God, was it seemed like that's what people were saying. And so one of the things I point out there is the B theory affirms succession, like actual succession. They're not saying it's just illusory succession. They want to say the passage of time is illusion. Some of them do. Some of them want to say actually they give you the real passage, but they don't want to deny succession. Nobody wants to deny succession. There is real succession. There is real change in the B block. And so I was like, okay, you guys are just being inconsistent with the B theory. All right.
Yeah.
Fancy that.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And then real quick, I did want to ask kind of along the same lines as, if, say, someone affirms a timeless God and a B theory, does this in any way apply, and maybe I'm wrong here, that the universe would be necessary? And I put air quotes around necessary because I realize they would want to say, even if the universe exists co-eternally with God, it's still contingent upon his will. And so I realize that would be a response. To me, it's, as someone who wants to still affirm God's divine aseity, I still see it as problematic, but I'm curious as to your views on it.
Yeah, so I've got some different kinds of arguments where I want to go, you can't get it. You're going to get necessity. You can't get a contingency. And so I've got these modal collapse arguments that I run based on divine simplicity. And someone like Catherine Rogers, who affirms timelessness, affirms simplicity, and affirms like the B theory of time, she just goes, yeah, that's the result. You get this like modal collapse. Don't call it modal collapse though. That's ugly. Call it modal simplicity. And I'm like, That's fine, if that's the way you want to call it. But you get the end result either the same way. And a lot of people don't like that. But Kate is just so like intellectually honest and rigorous. She's like, but this is just where the arguments lead.
Mhm.
Tell me what you're going to do. And so you have a lot of people trying to push back against her and go, this can't be the end result. This can't be the conclusion. And I just want to agree with her. Go like, sounds more intellectually honest. Sounds like that is where it goes. Here's some recent work I'm doing though. So there's this philosopher named Timothy Williamson who wants to affirm a necessitarian view of the world, like the world really is like absolutely necessary. And he says the B theory just entails this view. And what he calls it is a permanentist ontology. So it's permanentism. And what that means is everything always exists, which is like going to be contrasted with like a kind of ontology that you're going to get from an A theory where sometimes some things do not exist. And so Williamson is just like, if you're going to have this B theory, you're just going to get this permanentism. You're just going to get everything's always existing. And it just entails that there's going to be this necessity, because there's never like a state of affairs where this stuff doesn't exist. It just is existing, full stop. How's that not a necessity? Right. And so he's got a lot more like details to that story, but he thinks, and he's again affirming the B theory and saying, yeah, it just gives you necessity, like a necessitarian world. So those are two B theorists right there going, yeah, you get necessity.
Okay, no, that's good. And last thing before we sum up is one thing I argued with people on my show before who said, I think I've had two people on my show who have argued that God is timeless, and then he can create a universe but then still remain outside of it timelessly. And one thing I said was, well, hold on, even if you asserted that God creates a B block universe, you still affirm moment A, God exists without the universe, and moment B, he exists with the universe. So it seems to me they're still trapped with a temporal God. Does that, am I going okay there?
No, I understand the exact move you want to make, because that is the problem with creation ex nihilo and timelessness. Is creation ex nihilo very explicitly says there's a state of affairs where God exists without the universe, and there's a state of affairs where God exists with the universe. You see this in all the early church fathers. You see this throughout the Middle Ages. You see historians like Alexander Brody saying, "Yep, that's the view of all the medievals." You see David Ferguson say, "Yep, that's the view of all the early church fathers," and on it goes. So yeah, that's creation ex nihilo. What you see, though, from Paul Helm and Catherine Rogers, who affirm timelessness and they affirm the B theory, they're really explicit that there is no state of affairs where God exists without the universe. Okay. And they see this as a response to the objection of the inconsistency between creation ex nihilo and timelessness, because they're like, well, yeah, if you've got God by himself and then God with stuff, well, yeah, you're going to get change. And they're like, well, you just got God with all the stuff all the time. And William Lane Craig said that's just not creation ex nihilo. Kate and Paul push back and go, yeah, it is. It's consistent with creation ex nihilo. I've got some new stuff working on it going, you have literally just denied what everybody has said of what creation ex nihilo is, because it clearly says state of affairs without creation. And in fact, what your view looks like is panentheism, and panentheists explicitly say creation ex nihilo is false and God always exists with a universe of some sort. And so if you want to say it's always God and plus creation, there's never a moment where God's without creation, I'm like, that's panentheism. And yeah, you want to be a classical theist, you don't want to be a panentheist. You're not doing a very good job then. You've rejected something that classical theism affirms, and you're affirming explicitly what the panentheist affirms. So, okay. So there's some problems here. Yeah. No, this is, I think, been one of my favorite episodes that we've done. I changed my mind live on air. That was really cool. I've definitely heard a lot of new stuff. So yeah, I guess to sum up for people who, let's say, both are new to this topic and aren't, I think we want to affirm an A theory. We want to affirm God's divine temporality. But of course, that doesn't mean that he changes in his essential nature, but I think it means he does relate better to us. Is there anything you'd like to add? Yeah, if you're wanting to find like a good summary of the topic, my friend Natalia Ding has a really good book just called God and Time. And it's a really short and sweet introduction to the topic that just came out, I think, just 2 years ago. I've got an interview with her on my podcast as well, and the book is less than 60 pages. So it's really short and sweet introduction that gives you everything you need to know about the topic. So it'll give you a nice summary of both views, arguments for and against each view.
Awesome. Yeah, and then the two book overlays I have here at the end of Timeless God, God and Emotion, I would highly recommend. I'm still going to get them and read them. And if you guys are new to this channel, subscribe, turn on notifications. The best thing you can do for the algorithm is comment, that makes sure the video gets out there. People see it. I would really appreciate it. We're actually going to go now to Web Extended with Dr. Ryan Mullins at subscribestar.com/TUA if you guys want to head over there to see what we're going to do on Web Extended. And until next time, Dr. Ryan Mullins, thank you so much for being here, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me.